Port Harcourt stands today as one of Nigeria's most important cities, the economic heartbeat of the Niger Delta, and the undisputed oil capital of West Africa. But this bustling metropolis of over 2 million people was not always the industrial giant we know today. The story of Port Harcourt is a tale of transformation that spanned centuries, from ancient fishing camps and trading posts to colonial ambition, from railway terminals to oil refineries, and from Civil War battleground to cultural renaissance. In this edition of Back in History, we trace the complete history of Port Harcourt from its earliest beginnings to the present day. We explore the ancient peoples who first called this region home. We examine the colonial forces that created the modern city. We witness its role in Nigeria's independence and civil war. We document its transformation into the nation's oil capital and assess its continuing evolution as a center of commerce, culture, and sometimes serious political controversy in contemporary Nigeria. We welcome you all to this edition of Back in History. To understand how Port Harcourt came to be, we must first journey back centuries to a time when the area was dominated by dense waterways, mangrove forest, and the rhythms of riverine life. Long before any colonial administrator dreamt of building a port, long before the first railway line was laid or the first drop of crude oil was discovered, this stretch of the central Niger Delta was home to sophisticated societies that had mastered the art of living with the rivers. The landscape itself shaped everything about life in this region. Unlike the solid ground of Nigeria's northern savannas or the forest uplands of the Middle Belt, the Niger Delta was a world of water, where rivers branched and merged in endless patterns, where the line between land and sea was never quite fixed, and where the tides brought both opportunity and challenges twice each day. This was not an empty wilderness waiting for development, but a complex ecosystem that had supported human communities for centuries. The Ijaw people were among the earliest inhabitants of this riverine world. They had developed remarkable skills in navigation, fishing, and trading, using their intimate knowledge of the waterways to move goods and people across vast distances. Their settlements were carefully positioned to take advantage of river currents, fishing grounds, and trading opportunities, creating a network of communities that stretched across the delta. Alongside the Ijaw were the trading towns of Okrika and Bonny, which had grown into powerful commercial centers long before European traders arrived on the scene. These communities had established sophisticated systems of governance, trade regulation, and diplomatic relations that allowed them to prosper in the challenging delta environment. They were not simply fishing villages, but complex societies with their own systems of law, religion, and social organization. Further inland, the Kwere people who called themselves Ihuruna had established farming communities on the slightly higher ground that would later become the site of Port Harcourt itself. Unlike their riverine neighbors who lived primarily from fishing and trading, the Kwere people had developed agricultural techniques suited to the delta environment, growing crops like yam, cassava, and plantain in the spaces between the waterways. The Kwere communities around what would become Port Harcourt included groups like the Diobo and Rebisi people, who had established villages, markets, and farmlands in the area for generations. These were not temporary settlements, but permanent communities with their own histories, traditions, and claims to the land that would later become highly significant when colonial authorities began acquiring territories for their new port city. The 19th century brought dramatic changes to this ancient pattern of life. The international slave trade, which had connected the Niger Delta to global markets for centuries, was gradually being replaced by a new form of commerce that would prove equally transformative. European traders began arriving in increasing numbers, not to buy human beings this time around, but to purchase palm oil and palm kernels that grew abundantly in the Delta forest. This shift from slave trading to palm oil exports was so significant that European merchants began calling the region the Oil Rivers, a name that would stick for decades and eventually give its name to British colonial administrative units. The palm oil trade created new opportunities for local communities, but also new challenges as traditional power structures adapted to changing economic realities. The palm oil economy was not simply a matter of Europeans arriving to extract resources from passive local communities. Instead, it required complex partnerships between European trading firms and local merchants, chiefs, and producers who understood how to harvest palm fruits, process them into oil, and transform the product through the intricate delta waterways to coastal ports where European ships could collect them. These partnerships created wealth for some, but also generated conflicts over trade routes, pricing, and political control. European traders became increasingly frustrated with what they saw as the unpredictable nature of dealing with independent African merchants and rulers. They wanted more control over the trade, more predictable access to products, and more security for their investments. At the same time, the discovery of coal in the Nigerian interior, particularly at Enugu in 1909, created new pressures for better transportation links between the interior and the coast. Coal was essential for powering the steamships and industrial machinery of the early 20th century, and British colonial authorities saw enormous potential in Nigeria's coal deposits if only they could get the coal to international markets efficiently. The existing system of using canoes and small boats to transport goods through the Niger Delta waterways to established ports was adequate for palm oil and other traditional exports, but it was not suitable at all for the large quantities of coal that the colonial government hoped to export. What was needed was a new port with deeper water access to large ships combined with a railway link that could carry coal directly from the mines to the port. In the 1880s, Britain had begun formalizing its control over the Niger Delta region through a series of administrative arrangements. The Oil Rivers Protectorate was established in 1884, followed by the Niger Coast Protectorate in 1893. These arrangements were designed to give Britain official control over trade in the region, while preventing other European powers, particularly Germany and France, from establishing their own footholds in what was becoming an increasingly valuable economic zone. The decision to create a new port city was not taken lightly. Colonial authorities had to consider questions of geography, engineering, and politics. Where exactly should the new port be located? How could it be connected to the interior by railway? How would local communities be affected by the massive construction projects that would be required? These were the questions that the colonial authorities asked before embarking on any projects. After careful study, colonial engineers determined that the ideal location would be upstream from the established coastal ports on the Bonny River estuary, where there was adequate depth for large ships but also solid enough ground for major construction projects. The site they selected was the territory of the Ikwere communities, particularly in areas that had been farmed and settled on by the Diobu and Rebisi group for generations. In 1912, work began on what would become one of the most ambitious construction projects in colonial West Africa. The colonial administration had to acquire land from local village groups, a process that involved negotiations, payments, and sometimes coercion. The Diobu and Rebisi communities found their ancestral farmlands being surveyed, divided, and incorporated into the colonial government's grand plan for a modern port city. The land acquisition process created grievances that would echo through Port Harcourt's history for decades to come. Local communities lost not just individual farms and homesteads, but entire areas that had been integral to their economic and social systems. Fishing grounds, markets, sacred sites, and agricultural areas were all affected by the colonial construction project. The town plan that emerged followed European colonial models that had been used in other parts of Africa and Asia. There were distinct areas designated for different purposes and different populations. The port facilities themselves, with their wharves, warehouses, and loading equipment, occupied the waterfront areas. Adjacent to the port was a commercial district where trading companies could establish offices and storage facilities. Most controversially, the colonial plan included separate residential areas for Europeans and Africans. The government reserved area, which would later become known as GRA, was designed as an exclusive European quarter with wide streets, large plots, and modern amenities. This area was carefully separated from the sections where African workers and traders were expected to live, establishing patterns of spatial segregation that would influence the city's development for generations. The construction of Port Harcourt required enormous amounts of labor, both skilled and unskilled. Some of this labor was provided through contracts with workers who came voluntarily from across the region, attracted by the wages being offered for construction work. However, colonial records also make clear that forced labor was used extensively, particularly for the heavy manual work of clearing land, moving earth, and laying railway tracks. The Eastern Line Railway, which was designed to connect the new port to the coal mines at Enugu, was one of the most challenging engineering projects of its time in West Africa. The railway had to cross rivers, swamps, and difficult terrain while maintaining grades suitable for coal-carrying trains. Construction began in 1913 and required workers from across Nigeria and beyond, creating one of the region's first major multicultural workforces. On a day that would prove historically significant, Governor Sir Frederick Lord Lugard officially named the new settlement Port Harcourt in 1913. The name honored Lewis Vernon Harcourt, who was serving as the British Colonial Secretary at the time. This naming ceremony was more than just an administrative formality. It marked the official recognition of Port Harcourt as a permanent colonial settlement with its own distinct identity. The choice of name reflected the colonial government's intention for the new city. This was not to be simply another trading post or temporary administrative center, but a major port that would serve the entire region and contribute to the economic development of the British colonial empire. The name Port Harcourt announced to the world that this was a place of ambition and permanent significance. The port began operations in 1913, even before all the construction was complete. The first ships to use the new facilities carried palm oil and other traditional exports, but everyone involved knew that coal would soon become the primary cargo. The early operations were modest by later standards, but they represented a fundamental shift in how the Niger Delta connected to global markets. By 1916, the Eastern Line Railway was complete, creating the transportation link that colonial authorities had envisioned. Coal could now travel directly from the mines at Enugu to the port at Port Harcourt, where it could be loaded onto ships bound for Britain and other international markets. This railway connection transformed Port Harcourt from a regional port into a strategic asset of imperial significance. The completion of the railway also accelerated the growth of the town itself. Workers who had come for construction jobs decided to stay and establish permanent businesses. Traders from across Nigeria began setting up operations in Port Harcourt to take advantage of the new transportation opportunities. The port attracted not just Nigerian merchants, but also Lebanese, Syrians, and other international traders who saw opportunities in this growing commercial center. The early years of Port Harcourt were characterized by rapid change and constant construction. The original port facilities were expanded and improved to handle larger volumes of cargo. New residential areas were developed to house the growing population. Commercial districts emerged where traders and service providers could establish their businesses. However, this rapid growth also created tensions and challenges. The regional Ikwere communities found their traditional way of life disrupted by the constant construction and the arrival of thousands of newcomers. Competition for land, jobs, and trading opportunities sometimes led to conflicts between different groups. The colonial government had to balance its development goals with the need to maintain peace and order in the growing town. The colonial administration established systems of governance that reflected both British administrative practices and the realities of ruling a diverse, rapidly growing population. Traditional rulers were incorporated into the colonial system in some areas, while direct business administration was implemented in others. These governance arrangements would have lasting impacts on Port Harcourt's political development. By 1916, Port Harcourt had been transformed from fishing camps and farmlands into what would become one of West Africa's most strategic ports. The basic infrastructure was in place: the deep water port facilities, the railway connection to the interior, and the urban framework that would support further growth. But the young city's greatest test lay ahead, as global conflicts and the discovery of black gold would reshape Port Harcourt's destiny forever. As global conflicts and the discovery of black gold would reshape Port Harcourt forever, the young port city that had emerged from the mangrove swamps was about to be tested by world wars, transformed by oil, and forever changed by civil war. The period from 1917 to 1970 would see Port Harcourt evolve from a colonial coal port into the beating hearts of Nigeria's petroleum industry and a crucial player in the nation's struggle for independence and unity. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 had initially seemed like a distant European affair to many residents of Port Harcourt, but the colonial nature of the conflict soon brought the war directly to West Africa. The German colony of Cameroon, which bordered Nigeria to the east, became a target for British military operations. The Port Harcourt strategic location made it an ideal staging ground for these campaigns. The port's facilities, which had been designed primarily for coal exports, proved remarkably adaptable to military logistics. British forces used Port Harcourt as a base for assembling troops, supplies, and equipment destined for operations against German positions in Cameroon. The railway line to Enugu, originally built for coal transport, carried military supplies and personnel, while the port itself handled the complex task of coordinating supplies from Britain with local resources and personnel. This military role had several important consequences for Port Harcourt's development. First, it demonstrated the city's strategic value beyond its original economic function, establishing it as a key logistical hub that could support complex operations across a wide area. Second, the presence of military personnel and activities accelerated urban development as new facilities were built and existing infrastructure was expanded to meet military needs. The war also brought Port Harcourt into more direct contact with global events and international networks. Military personnel from Britain and other parts of the empire passed through the city, while local residents found themselves contributing to a worldwide conflict. This experience helped establish Port Harcourt's identity as a place connected to broader currents of history rather than simply a regional trading center. Following Germany's defeat and the end of World War I, Port Harcourt entered a period of steady growth and development during the 1920s and 1930s. The coal trade continued to be important, but the port also handled increasing volumes of palm oil, timber, and other regional products. The city's population grew as people from across Nigeria and beyond came seeking economic opportunities in the expanding commercial center. During these interwar decades, Port Harcourt began developing the municipal infrastructure that would support its growth into a major city. New residential areas were established beyond the original colonial core. Commercial districts expanded, and public facilities like schools, hospitals, and government buildings were constructed. The city was beginning to take on the character of a permanent urban center rather than simply a colonial outpost. The development of Port Harcourt during this period was not without challenges. The global economic depression of the 1930s affected demand for Nigerian exports, while competition from other ports and transportation routes threatened the city's commercial position. Local politics became more complex as different communities competed for influence and resources in the growing city. However, these challenges also spurred innovation and adaptation. Local entrepreneurs developed new businesses and services, while colonial authorities invested in infrastructure improvements designed to maintain Port Harcourt's competitive advantages. The city was learning to adapt to changing circumstances, a skill that would prove essential in the decades ahead. World War II brought even greater challenges to Port Harcourt than the first global conflict had. Once again, the city's strategic location and excellent port facilities made it valuable for military operations, but this time, the scale of activity was much bigger. Britain and Allied forces used Port Harcourt as a major supply base for operations across West and North Africa. The war years saw massive expansion of port facilities and supporting infrastructure. New wharves, warehouses, and transportation links were built to handle the enormous volumes of military supplies passing through the city. The population swelled as military personnel, support workers, and migrants seeking wartime employment opportunities arrived in unprecedented numbers. Perhaps more importantly, World War II exposed many Port Harcourt residents to new ideas about democracy, self-governance, and human rights. The war was fought, at least officially, to defend democratic values against fascism, and these ideals resonated strongly with educated Africans who saw contributions between the principles the Allies claimed to defend and the reality of colonial rule. The end of World War II in 1945 marked the beginning of a new era in which colonial authorities would face increasing pressure for political reform and eventual independence. In Port Harcourt, as elsewhere in Nigeria, the war had created a generation of people who had gained new skills, perspectives, and confidence through their wartime experiences. However, the most transformative event in Port Harcourt's history was still to come. On January 15, 1956, in a swampy area called Aloibiri, in what is now Bayelsa State, Shell Dachi made Nigeria's first commercial oil discovery. This event would change not just Port Harcourt but all of Nigeria in ways that few people at the time could have imagined. The oil discovery at Aloibiri was the result of years of exploration by Shell and other international oil companies. Geological surveys had suggested that the Niger Delta might contain significant oil reserves, but it took sophisticated technology and considerable investment to locate and develop these resources. The successful well at Aloibiri proved that Nigeria's oil potential was real and commercially viable. Production began in 1958, and in February of that year, Nigeria exported its first crude oil to international markets. The oil moved through pipelines that had been constructed to connect the interior oil fields with coastal facilities at Port Harcourt and the Bonny area. Almost overnight, Port Harcourt found itself at the center of what would become one of the world's most important oil-producing regions. The impact of oil discovery on Port Harcourt was immediate and dramatic. International oil companies established major operations in the city, bringing with them thousands of expatriate workers, advanced technology, and enormous capital investments. Local businesses boomed as they provided services to the oil industry, while new industries emerged to support petroleum operations. The transformation was not limited to business and industry. Oil revenues began flowing to government treasuries at federal, regional, and local levels, providing resources for infrastructure development, education, healthcare, and other public services. Port Harcourt became the beneficiary of massive public and private investments that accelerated its development into a modern city. In 1965, Nigeria's first major oil refinery complex began operations in Port Harcourt. This facility, known as the Old Refinery, was designed to process Nigerian crude oil into gasoline, diesel, kerosene, and other petroleum products for both domestic consumption and exports. The refinery complex represented a major step towards developing Nigeria's downstream oil industry sector rather than simply exporting. The establishment of the refinery had enormous implications for Port Harcourt's development. It created thousands of jobs, from highly skilled technical positions to support and service roles. It also established Port Harcourt as not just a point for export of crude oil, but as a center for petroleum processing and value addition. Around the same time that oil was transforming Port Harcourt's economy, Nigeria was undergoing its own political transformation towards independence. The country had been moving gradually towards self-governance throughout the 1950s, with increasing responsibilities transferred from British colonial authorities to Nigerian political class. On October 1, 1961, Nigeria gained independence from Britain, becoming a sovereign nation for the first time in its modern history. For Port Harcourt, independence meant new opportunities and challenges. As a major economic center in the newly independent country, the city would play an important role in Nigeria's development, but it would also be affected by the political tensions and conflicts that marked the early years of independence. Port Harcourt's economic importance continued to grow after independence. The city attracted migrant workers and professionals from across southern Nigeria, creating a diverse cosmopolitan population. The combination of oil industry opportunities, port facilities, educational institutions, and government services made Port Harcourt one of Nigeria's most dynamic urban centers. In 1967, the federal government undertook a major administrative reorganization, dividing Nigeria's existing regions into 12 states. This reorganization was designed to address ethnic tensions and create more manageable administrative units. As part of this process, Rivers State was created on May 27, 1967, with Port Harcourt as its capital. The creation of Rivers State had profound implications for Port Harcourt. As a state capital, the city became the center of government for the entire Rivers region, bringing additional government jobs, institutions, and investments. The status also enhanced Port Harcourt's political importance and gave local leaders more influence over the city's development. However, the creation of Rivers State occurred during one of the most turbulent periods in Nigerian history. Ethnic tensions, political conflicts, and disputes over oil revenues were creating serious strains within the Nigerian Federation. These tensions came to a head in 1967 when the Eastern region, led by Lieutenant Colonel Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu, military governor of the Eastern region, declared independence of the Republic of Biafra. The Nigerian Civil War, which lasted from 1967 to 1970, would test Port Harcourt as never before seen. The city found itself at the center of a brutal conflict that would determine not just Nigeria's political future, but also the fate of millions of people caught up in the fighting. For the breakaway Republic of Biafra, Port Harcourt represented a crucial lifeline to the outside world. The city's port facilities provided Biafra's primary access to international markets and potential sources of military supplies. Control of Port Harcourt was essential for Biafra's survival as an independent state, making it a primary target for federal forces seeking to end the secession. The federal government understood Port Harcourt's strategic importance and made its capture a top priority. Federal forces implemented blockades designed to prevent supplies from reaching Biafran territory through Port Harcourt, while also preparing for a direct assault on the city itself. The siege of Port Harcourt began in early 1968 as federal forces launched a carefully coordinated campaign to capture the city and its vital port facilities. The operation, which became known as the Invasion of Port Harcourt, lasted from March 8 to May 24, 1968, and involved some of the most intense fighting of the entire Civil War. Federal forces approached Port Harcourt from multiple directions using a combination of ground assault, naval bombardment, and air attacks to overwhelm Biafran defenses. The fighting was particularly fierce because both sides understood that control of the city would determine the outcome of the entire war. Biafran forces fought desperately to defend Port Harcourt, knowing that its loss would effectively cut off their access to international support and supplies. Civilian residents found themselves trapped in the middle of intense urban warfare, with many forced to flee their homes as the fighting intensified. The fall of Port Harcourt to federal forces on May 24, 1968 marked a decisive turning point in the Nigerian Civil War. With the capture of the city and its port facilities, Biafra lost its primary connection to the outside world. The federal blockade could now be enforced more effectively, making it increasingly difficult for Biafra to obtain the supplies needed to continue fighting. The capture of Port Harcourt also had important psychological and political effects. It demonstrated that federal forces could successfully assault and capture major Biafran strongholds, undermining confidence in Biafra's ability to maintain its independence. International observers began to recognize that the federal government was likely to achieve military victory. For Port Harcourt itself, the end of the siege brought both relief and new challenges. The city had suffered significant damage during the fighting, with many buildings destroyed and infrastructure disrupted. The population had been displaced, businesses had been shattered, and normal urban life had been suspended for months. The federal victory also triggered massive population movements as people who had fled during the fighting began returning to assess the damage and rebuild their lives. At the same time, many Igbo residents who had supported Biafra found themselves in a difficult position, uncertain about their future in a reunited Nigeria. The aftermath of the war created complex issues around property, citizenship, and reconciliation that would affect Port Harcourt for years to come. The federal government proclaimed a policy of no victor, no vanquished, designed to promote reconciliation and reintegration, but implementing this policy in practice proved seriously challenging. Many properties that had been abandoned during the war were declared abandoned property and taken over by the government or by new occupants. This created lasting grievances among people who lost homes, businesses, and other assets during the conflict. The property issues became part of the larger challenge of rebuilding trust and social cohesion in post-war Nigeria. Despite these challenges, the end of the Civil War marked the beginning of a new chapter in Port Harcourt's history. The city would soon experience unprecedented growth and development as Nigeria's oil boom transformed it into one of Africa's most important petroleum centers. The 1970s would bring challenges that would dwarf even dramatic transformation that oil discovery had initiated in the 1950s and 1960s as petrodollars flowed and Nigeria's oil capital emerged from the ashes of war. The 1970s would usher in an era of unprecedented prosperity and growth for Port Harcourt, but also the beginning of environmental and social challenges that continue to shape the city till today. The final chapter of Port Harcourt's history is one of remarkable transformation, cultural renaissance, and the ongoing struggle to balance economic development with environmental protection and social justice. The end of the Nigerian Civil War in 1970 coincided with a period of rapidly rising global oil prices that would transform Nigeria into one of the world's major oil exporters. The 1970s oil boom brought enormous revenues to the Nigerian government and massive investments to Port Harcourt as the center of the country's petroleum industry. What had begun as a modest colonial port was about to become one of Africa's most important industrial cities. The scale of investment in Port Harcourt during the oil boom years was unprecedented. The federal government, flush with petroleum revenues, launched massive infrastructure projects designed to expand and modernize the city's capacity to serve as Nigeria's oil capital. Existing port facilities were enlarged and upgraded, new terminals were constructed, and the entire logistics network was expanded to handle the enormous volumes of equipment, supplies, and personnel required by the growing oil industry. The Port Harcourt refinery complex, which had begun operations in 1965, was significantly expanded during this period. Additional refining capacity was added to process increasing volumes of Nigerian crude oil, while new facilities were built to produce a wider range of petroleum products. The refinery complex became not just an industrial facility, but a symbol of Nigeria's ambitions to develop its downstream oil industry sector rather than simply exporting raw crude. One of the most significant developments during this period was the creation of the One Port Complex, which emerged as a major hub for oil and gas logistics operations. Located strategically to serve offshore oil operations, One developed into one of West Africa's most important ports for handling the specialized equipment and supplies required by the petroleum industry. The port was also expanded to include container facilities that would handle general cargo, making it a key node in regional and international trade networks. The oil boom transformed Port Harcourt's physical landscape as new industrial areas, residential developments, and commercial districts were constructed to accommodate the city's expansive growth. The population increased dramatically as people from across Nigeria and beyond arrived seeking opportunities in the oil industry and its supporting sectors. By the end of the 1970s, Port Harcourt had evolved from a regional center into a truly international city. This period also saw major investments in education and human development that would have lasting impact on Port Harcourt's character. In 1975, the University of Port Harcourt was established, bringing higher education opportunities to the Niger Delta region for the first time. The university was designed to serve not just the local population, but also to attract students and faculty from across Nigeria and beyond. The University of Port Harcourt quickly developed particular strengths in petroleum engineering, geology, and other fields relevant to the oil industry. But it also established programs in medicine, law, arts, and social sciences that contributed to the city's intellectual and cultural development. The presence of a major university helped establish Port Harcourt as more than just an industrial center, creating a foundation for research, innovation, and cultural activities. In 1980, Rivers State University received its charter, further expanding educational opportunities in the region. The establishment of multiple universities reflected both the wealth generated by oil revenues and the recognition that sustainable development required investments in human capital as well as physical infrastructure. However, the rapid growth and industrialization of the 70s and 80s also created serious environmental problems that would become increasingly difficult to ignore. The intensive oil extraction activities throughout the Niger Delta generated massive environmental damage through oil spills, gas flaring, and the disruption of traditional ecosystems. Waterways that had supported fishing communities for centuries became polluted, agricultural land was contaminated, and air quality deteriorated due to constant gas flaring. The environmental impact of oil extraction were not distributed equally across Port Harcourt's population. While some residents benefited enormously from oil industry employment and business opportunities, many local communities, particularly those in rural areas surrounding the city, experienced severe environmental degradation that threatened their traditional livelihoods without receiving adequate compensation or alternative economic opportunities. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, environmental degradation had become so severe that local communities began organizing to demand better environmental protection and greater sharing of oil revenues. These environmental justice movements would eventually grow into some of Nigeria's most significant social and political movements. The most prominent of these movements was the movement for the survival of the Ogoni people known as MOSOP, which was led by Ken Saro-Wiwa, a writer, television producer, and environmental rights activist. MOSOP campaigned against the environmental destruction of Ogoni land, which had suffered particularly severe damage from oil extraction activities, and demanded that the Ogoni people receive a fair share of revenues from oil extracted from their territory. Ken Saro-Wiwa and MOSOP used a combination of peaceful protest, legal challenges, and international advocacy to draw attention to the environmental and social cost of oil extraction in the Niger Delta. Their campaign gained international attention and support, particularly from environmental groups and human rights organizations in Europe and America. The Nigerian government and international oil companies initially tried to dismiss or suppress MOSOP's activities, but the movement's persistence and growing international support made it increasingly difficult to ignore. The conflict escalated throughout the early 1990s as MOSOP organized mass demonstrations and work stoppages that disrupted oil production activities in the Niger Delta. The crisis reached a tragic climax on November 10, 1995, when Ken Saro-Wiwa and 8 other Ogoni leaders, who became known as the Ogoni 9, were executed in Port Harcourt, following what international observers widely condemned as a flawed legal process. The executions were ordered by Nigeria's military government under General Sani Abacha, despite widespread international appeals for clemency. The execution of the Ogoni 9 in Port Harcourt sparked international outrage and led to Nigeria's suspension from the Commonwealth of Nations and the imposition of various international sanctions. The event also galvanized environmental and human rights movements across the Niger Delta and established Ken Saro-Wiwa as a martyr for environmental justice causes. The international attention generated by the Ogoni crisis forced both the Nigerian government and the international oil companies to acknowledge the environmental and social cost of oil extraction and to begin implementing reforms designed to address some of the most serious problems. However, many of the underlying issues that had sparked the original protest remained unresolved till today, and environmental activism continued to be a significant factor in the Niger Delta politics. Despite these serious challenges, Port Harcourt continued to grow and develop throughout the 1990s and 2000s. The city's role as Nigeria's oil capital remains secure, and new investments continue to flow into both the petroleum industry and supporting sectors. The port facilities were further modernized and expanded, while new industrial complexes were established to serve the growing oil and gas sector. The city also began developing a reputation for cultural and intellectual activities that went beyond its industrial base. The presence of multiple universities, combined with the cosmopolitan character of a city that attracted people from across Nigeria and beyond, created a vibrant cultural scene that included literature, music, theater, and visual arts. Port Harcourt's cultural renaissance reached international recognition in 2014 when UNESCO named the city as the World Book Capital, acknowledging local efforts to promote reading and literary culture. This designation was particularly significant because it recognized Port Harcourt's achievements in areas other than oil and industry, demonstrating the city's evolution into a more diverse and sophisticated urban center. The UNESCO designation was the result of years of effort by local organizations, educational institutions, and government agencies to promote literacy and literary culture throughout the city and surrounding region. The program included the establishment of new libraries, literary festivals, reading programs in schools, and support for local writers and publishers. Some of these were sponsored by the oil companies operating in Port Harcourt. The recognition as World Book Capital helped change international perceptions of Port Harcourt from a city known primarily for oil and environmental problems to one recognized for its cultural achievements and educational initiatives. It also boasted local pride and encouraged further investments in cultural and educational programs. However, the designation also highlighted some of the contradictions and challenges facing contemporary Port Harcourt. While the city was being celebrated for its cultural achievements, it continued to struggle with environmental degradation, social inequality, and a complex legacy of rapid oil-driven development. In recent decades, Port Harcourt's port facilities have continued to expand and diversify beyond their original focus on oil exports. The One Port Complex has developed into one of West Africa's most important container terminals, handling general cargo as well as oil and gas logistics. These developments have helped reduce the city's dependence on the petroleum sector while maintaining its importance as a regional transportation and logistic hub. The Port Harcourt refining complex has faced more mixed fortunes in recent decades. While the facilities remain important for Nigeria's downstream oil industry, they have experienced periods of shutdown, underperformance, and rehabilitation that have sparked ongoing debates about Nigeria's refining policy and the management of state-owned petroleum assets. The challenges facing the refinery complex reflect broader issues in Nigeria's oil industry, including questions about the optimal balance between government ownership and private sector participation, the technical and management challenges of operating complex industrial facilities, and the political pressures that often influence decision-making about petroleum industry investments. Despite these challenges, Port Harcourt remains central to Nigeria's petroleum industry and continues to attract more investment from both international oil companies and the Nigerian government. New projects continue to be developed in offshore oil and gas fields that use Port Harcourt and surrounding facilities as their onshore base. The city has also become increasingly important as a center for oil and gas services, with numerous companies providing specialized technical services to petroleum operations throughout West Africa. This services sector has helped diversify Port Harcourt's economy while maintaining its connection to the oil industry. Contemporary Port Harcourt faces the ongoing challenge of balancing economic development with environmental protection and social equality. While oil wealth has created enormous opportunities and transformed the city into a modern metropolis, it has also generated environmental degradation and social tensions that remain unresolved. The legacy of colonial land acquisition continues to influence contemporary politics and development in Port Harcourt. The regional displacement of Ikwere communities like the Diobu and Rebisi groups created grievances that have been compounded by subsequent development projects and population growth. Questions of land ownership, traditional rights, and compensation for historical injustices remain active issues in local politics. The city's rapid growth has also created typical urban challenges, including housing shortages, traffic congestion, and inadequate public services and environmental pollution. While all revenues have provided resources for addressing some of these problems, the scale and complexity of managing a rapidly growing metropolis in a challenging delta environment continue to test local governance capacity. Port Harcourt today represents both the opportunities and challenges of resource-driven development in Africa. The city's transformation from fishing camps and farmland to a major industrial center demonstrates what is possible when natural resource wealth is combined with strategic investments in infrastructure and human development. At the same time, Port Harcourt's history illustrates the environmental and social cost that can accompany rapid resource extraction and industrialization. The ongoing struggles over environmental justice, community rights, and equitable development reflect broader challenges facing resource-rich regions around the world. The story of Port Harcourt is ultimately a story of transformation and adaptation. From the ancient Ijaw, Okrika, and Ikwere communities who first made this region their home, through the colonial administrators who created a modern port, to the oil industry workers and environmental activists who continue to shape the city today, Port Harcourt has been built by people who adapted to changing circumstances while working to build better futures for themselves and their communities. As Port Harcourt continues to evolve in the 21st century, it faces the ongoing challenge of building on its economic success while addressing the environmental and social issues that have accompanied rapid development. The city's experience offers important lessons about the opportunities and challenges of resource-driven development, the importance of environmental protection, and the need to ensure that economic growth benefits all members of society. The recognition of Port Harcourt as UNESCO World Book Capital demonstrated that the city has the capacity to excel in areas beyond oil and industry. This cultural achievement, combined with the presence of major universities and a diverse, educated population, provides a foundation for continued development in new directions. Looking towards the future, Port Harcourt's continued success will likely depend on its ability to diversify its economy, address environmental challenges, and build more inclusive forms of development that benefit all residents. The city's history of adaptation and transformation suggests that it has the capacity to meet these challenges, but success will require continued effort from government, business, and civil society. The story of Port Harcourt remains unfinished, with new chapters being written every day by the millions of people who call the city home. From its origins in the ancient Niger Delta to its current status as Nigeria's oil capital and beyond, Port Harcourt's history demonstrates the power of human creativity, adaptation, and determination to build better communities and brighter futures. Thanks for watching this edition of Back in History, and do remember to subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell for updates on every new video. I am your friend and host Ekeminiudim, bringing you the stories that shaped our nation and our continent. Until next time, keep exploring history with us.